Welcome to our deep dive into the world of defense procurement deals. Now I know what you're thinking. Defense procurement? That sounds about as thrilling as watching paint dry in slow motion. And you'd be right if, and this is a big if, you have no interest whatsoever in understanding the incredibly complex, often absurd and always fascinating ways countries go about acquiring the tools of their, let's call it, persuasion. Because that's what we're really talking about here, isn't it? Tanks, planes, missiles, all that fun stuff that makes you go, ooh, and at an air show, and deeply uncomfortable when you remember they're designed to, inflict harm. But before we get to the moral quandaries of it all, we've got to understand the how. How does a country decide it needs a new fleet of fighter jets? How does it choose between buying them outright or maybe just borrowing them from a friend? That's where the wild world of defense procurement deals comes in. Today we'll explore the various types of deals, from the relatively straightforward to the truly baffling, that countries engage in to acquire military equipment and services. Buckle up, kids, it's going to be a bumpy ride. First up, the old classic government-to-government deals, or G2G, for those who like their acronyms short and vaguely threatening. It's exactly what it sounds like. Two governments cutting out the middlemen, striking a deal. Think of it like buying a used car, except instead of a rusty Honda Civic, it's $1 billion stealth bomber, and instead of Dave from down the street, it's the entire military-industrial complex of a superpower. Now within the wonderful world of G2G deals, you've got your foreign military sales, or FMS, which is basically the US, saying, hey, we've got all this great military hardware just lying around. Anyone want some? Then there are grants, which are essentially freebies, usually with strings attached, like, remember who gave you those attack helicopters? Good, because we need you to vote with us at the UN next week. And of course, no discussion of G2G deals would be complete without mentioning bilateral agreements, which are basically fancy contracts between two countries that can involve anything from joint military exercises to technology sharing to, you guessed it, arms sales. The point is, when it comes to G2G deals, it's all about governments doing business with other governments, often with a healthy dose of geopolitical maneuvering thrown in for good measure. Next, we move from the cozy world of government handshakes to the cutthroat arena of direct commercial sales, or DCS. Here, it's all about private companies getting in on the action. Imagine Lockheed Martin, Boeing, BAE Systems, all those companies whose names sound like rejected Bond villain layers lining up to sell their wares directly to governments. DCS is essentially the free market at work, but instead of selling toasters and t-shirts, it's fighter jets, drones, and missile defense systems. Now, you might think this sounds like a recipe for disaster, and you wouldn't be entirely wrong. After all, giving private companies a direct line to sell weapons to governments does raise some ethical concerns, to put it mildly. But hey, who are we to judge? We're just here to understand how the sausage gets made, even if that sausage is a 120mm tank shell. The key takeaway here is that DCS is all about private companies making deals directly with governments, often with a lot of lobbying, backroom deals, and questionable ethics involved. But hey, that's the defense industry for you. Now let's talk about offsets. Imagine you're buying a car, a really, really expensive car, like fighter jet expensive. And the salesperson says, hey, to sweeten the deal, how about we throw in some free driving lessons and maybe build a car factory in your backyard? That's offsets in a nutshell. It's basically a way for countries to soften the blow of massive defense purchases by getting something in return. These can be direct offsets, like requiring the selling country to invest in the buying country's defense industry, maybe even build some of the equipment locally. Think technology transfer, joint production, that sort of thing. Then there are indirect offsets, which are a bit more, shall we say, creative. This is where things get interesting. We're talking about investments in completely unrelated sectors, like promising to buy a country's bananas in exchange for a squadron of helicopters. It sounds crazy, but hey, it's all about finding creative ways to make these deals work, both financially and politically. So the next time you hear about a country getting a great deal on a new weapons system, remember, there might be a whole lot more going on behind the scenes than meets the eye. Chapter 4. Let's face it, buying military hardware is expensive, like really expensive. It's like buying a new sports car every year, except instead of turning heads, it could potentially level a small city. So what's a cash-strapped country to do? Why, lease, of course. Leasing military equipment has become increasingly popular, especially for big-ticket items like fighter jets and warships. It's like renting a tuxedo for a special occasion. You get to look the part without having to shell out a fortune for something you'll only use occasionally. Leasing allows countries to access advanced weaponry without the massive upfront costs, which is great for balancing the books, but also raises some interesting questions about long-term defense planning and reliance on other countries. After all, you can't exactly return a leased fighter jet because you forgot to fill up the tank. But hey, who needs long-term planning when you can kick the can down the road and worry about it later, right? Chapter 5. Remember that time you and your friends pooled your allowances to buy that awesome video game console? Well, joint ventures and collaborative projects in the defense industry are kind of like that. Except instead of a video game console, it's a multi-billion-dollar weapon system that could potentially start a war. The idea here is simple. Why bear the burden of developing and producing expensive military hardware alone when you can team up with other countries and share the costs? It's a win-win in theory. Countries get access to cutting-edge technology, share the financial burden, and maybe even strengthen diplomatic ties in the process. Of course, these collaborations are not without their challenges. We're talking about different countries with different priorities, different design philosophies, and let's not forget, different languages, all trying to work together to build something that, let's be honest, is designed to blow things up. Chapter 6. Remember that warm, fuzzy feeling you get when you buy something locally made, that sense of supporting your community, keeping jobs at home, and sticking it to the man. Well, imagine that feeling, but instead of a hand-knitted scarf, it's a tank. That's the basic idea behind local procurement in the defense industry. Countries increasingly want to reduce their reliance on foreign suppliers and boost their own domestic industries. It makes sense, right? You create jobs, stimulate the economy, and reduce dependence on potentially unreliable or politically inconvenient foreign partners. Of course, it's not always that simple. Developing a robust domestic defense industry takes time, investment, and a lot of technical expertise, things that not every country has in abundance. But hey, at least it sounds good on paper, and that's half the battle, right? Imagine you're hosting a dinner party and you realize you're fresh out of toilet paper. Do you spend hours comparing prices, reading online reviews, and meticulously planning your purchase? Or do you grab the first roll you can find, even if it means paying a premium? Welcome to the world of emergency procurement, where speed trumps everything, even common sense. In times of crisis, whether it's a natural disaster, a sudden conflict, or a global pandemic that has you wishing you'd invested in some decent PPE, countries often need to bypass the usual lengthy procurement processes to get their hands on essential equipment quickly. This is where emergency procurement comes in, allowing governments to cut through the red tape and get what they need when they need it. Consequences be damned. Of course, this expedited process often comes with a hefty price tag, both financially and ethically. Ever wish you could buy a fully furnished apartment ready to move into? No assembly required. Well, that's the basic idea behind turnkey contracts in the defense industry. It's like ordering a complete home theater system, but instead of a big screen TV and surround sound, it's a state-of-the-art air defense system or a fully operational naval base. Essentially, the supplier takes care of everything. The equipment, the infrastructure, the training, the maintenance, the whole shebang. It's a convenient option for countries that want to avoid the hassle of managing complex projects themselves, but it also comes with risks. After all, when you're putting all your eggs in one basket, you better make sure that basket is pretty damn sturdy. The try before you buy option, a beloved staple of everything from mattresses to software subscriptions. But did you know it applies to military hardware too? That's right, countries can now lease a tank, take it for a spin, literally, and then decide if they want to commit to the full purchase. Leasing with an option to purchase allows countries to get their hands on equipment, evaluate its performance in the field, and then decide if it's worth the investment. It's a bit like a long test drive, except instead of parallel parking, you're testing out the tank's ability to withstand RPG fire. This option provides flexibility, especially in rapidly evolving technological landscapes, but it can also lead to some awkward situations. Imagine having to return a battle-tested tank because you decided it didn't quite match your army's aesthetic. Yeah, it's a great tank and all, but it clashes with our uniforms. Do you have it in beige? Remember the days before money when people bartered for goods and services, trading a chicken for a haircut, a goat for a plow, that sort of thing? Well, in the wacky world of defense procurement, that ancient practice is alive and well, albeit with slightly higher stakes. Welcome to the realm of counter-trade or barter deals, where countries get creative with their payment methods, short on cash but swimming in natural resources. No problem, just trade some oil, timber, or maybe even a few thousand tons of bananas for that shiny new squadron of fighter jets. It's a win-win, or at least that's what they'll tell you. Of course, these deals can get incredibly complex, with valuations, logistics, and the occasional geopolitical power play thrown in for good measure. But hey, at least it's more interesting than just paying with money, right? Remember when your gym teacher made you do the trust fall exercise? That feeling of unease, of blindly hoping the person behind you will actually catch you? That's kind of what public-private partnerships, or PPPs, feel like in the defense sector. It's all about governments and private companies teaming up, with the private sector investing in and often managing things like military infrastructure, logistics, or even training. Think of it like outsourcing your army's catering or laundry services, but on a much larger and potentially more concerning scale. The idea is to leverage private sector efficiency and innovation while freeing up government resources, but it also raises questions about accountability, transparency, and the potential for, shall we say, conflicting priorities. After all, when the bottom line is profit, things can get a little murky, especially when you're dealing with matters of national security. But hey, at least the PowerPoint presentations look impressive, right? Ever tried organizing a group project for school? Now imagine trying to coordinate a group project with dozens of countries, each with its own interests, budgets, and, let's be honest, levels of enthusiasm. That's the joyous experience of procurement through international organizations. We're talking about countries joining forces, pooling their resources, and navigating a labyrinthine bureaucracy to acquire military equipment or services collectively. Think NATO, the European Defence Agency, or any other organization that sounds like it was named by a committee of diplomats who really love acronyms. The idea is to achieve economies of scale, streamline interoperability, and present a united front, which all sounds great in theory. In practice, however, it often involves endless meetings, mountains of paperwork, and the occasional diplomatic spat over who gets to choose the colour scheme for the new tanks. But hey, at least it's better than going it alone, right? And there you have it, a comprehensive look at the various types of defence procurement deals. Each type has its own strategic, economic and political implications tailored to the specific needs of the purchasing country. We've explored the ins and outs of governments doing business with each other, private companies vying for lucrative contracts, and countries resorting to everything from bartering to leasing to get their hands on the latest military hardware. It's a complex, often opaque, and undeniably fascinating world, one that often operates in the shadows but has a profound impact on global security, geopolitics, and, let's be honest, the global economy. So the next time you see a headline about a major arms deal, remember that there's a lot more going on behind the scenes than meets the eye. Thanks for watching, and stay informed.